When you hear the word voodoo, what do you think of? Do you think voodoo dolls? Occult worship? Mind control? And how about zombies? I really hope you said zombies because Hollywood has worked very hard to link those two together. But what you probably didn't think of was church and prayer, which are integral parts of its history. So, would it surprise you to learn that voodoo is really a spiritual practice, like Protestant and Catholic traditions? Yeah, I said Catholics. In fact, voodoo in America has more in common with Catholicism than any other religion. Intrigued? Then let's dive in. And for our deeper understanding, we're going to walk the Voodoo Trail on the streets of the city where it was born, New Orleans, Louisiana. Because voodoo in New Orleans isn't like voodoo anywhere else. It's a blend of different African traditions with a mix of French and Spanish culture sprinkled with Haitian beliefs. And together, they create magic. But don't let the word magic fool you. Voodoo is also practiced as a form of religion. Our first stop on the Voodoo Trail is here at the Riverfront. I'm including our map in the description and pinned in the comments so you can follow along or even walk it yourself. Voodoo is rooted deeply in the old gods of Africa, who were brought to America with captured, enslaved people. And let's be clear, Africa is a continent, not a country. So we're not talking about one religious practice. We're talking about many. New Orleans was founded in 1718 as a colony of France and operated as the capital of the transatlantic slave trade in America from the early 1800s until emancipation. Ships would come up the Mississippi River and dock at the port of New Orleans before their captives were made to disembark. This is where the original practitioners of voodoo would have set foot for the first time in this country. Our second stop is here, at the Omni Hotel on St. Louis Street. This was once one of the largest auction houses of enslaved people in the country. After leaving the cargo ships, human beings were held in open pens, exposed to the elements, and treated as property along Esplanade and Chartres Street in the French Quarter. From there, they were brought to the St. Louis Hotel, now known as the present-day Omni Hotel, where they were stood up on auction blocks between columns while people dined, socialized, and bid on them. This drawing shows a depiction of the rotunda at the St. Louis Hotel, where people were displayed for sale in full view of the public. And here, this woman stands as an adult beside the very auction block on which she was sold as a child inside this very building. Now, the original St. Louis Hotel fell into disrepair after the end of the war, since its primary source of funding was abolished, and it sat empty through the turn of the century. It was ultimately torn down, in part, and rebuilt. However, if you'll look closely at this wall, original to the building, you can still see the word change from what was once the St. Louis Hotel and Exchange. This city acted as a melting pot for many different cultures while witnessing unspeakable human tragedy. As they were sold and bought by different owners, these enslaved people from different countries mixed and mingled, as did their religious practices. These practices were further influenced by the religions of their captors, Catholicism, which brings us to our third stop, Congo Square. New Orleans was established as a French colony during the reign of King Louis XV, and France, at that time, enforced what was known as the Code Noir, a set of laws written in 1685 governing the institution of owning people in its colonies. The code worked well for the Caribbean, but not for Louisiana, which had a sizable population of free people of color, as well as Native Americans and rough frontiersmen. The code required some revisions specific to this colony, and it was updated in 1724 with several new edicts the French hoped would tame some of the wilder elements in the colony. If you're curious about all that the Code Noir changed, check out the Field Notes section of our website where we cover it in more detail. But the change that impacted voodoo the most was one that said all enslaved individuals had to convert to Catholicism. The practice of any other religion became illegal. But these enslaved people didn't let that hold them back. They adapted. They converted to Catholicism in public. But in private, they continued their own religious practices, with a few subtle changes. This way, people could continue their prayers and rituals without being seen to break the law. And historically, many of these rituals took place right here in Congo Square, adjacent to Louis Armstrong Park in the Treme neighborhood. Congo Square became popular because the Code Noir gave the enslaved people of New Orleans 6 hours off every Sunday because it was a day of rest. And it meant enslaved people could mingle and meet openly with one another and with free people of color. They chose to spend that time here, where they shared their religious traditions and, equally important, their music. Because this isn't just the heart of voodoo. It's also the birthplace of jazz. This sculpture commemorates the square's role in bringing together these people from different backgrounds. You can see they're dancing and playing instruments and smiling, but down below you'll also find this chain, the symbol of their forced captivity under slavery. And here is where New Orleans voodoo begins to diverge significantly with practices in Western and Central Africa. Which takes us to our next stop, the New Orleans Historic Voodoo Museum, which preserves the cultural legacy of this specific branch of voodoo. The original names of many other deities also became interchanged with Catholic saints. So you may see in a New Orleans voodoo shop like this one, a blend of African gods mixed with Catholic saints. You may even see Saint Peter, often associated with Papa Legba, who can often be the protector of the crossroads. In fact, Catholic saints are commonly prayed to in voodoo. Look here and you'll see Chango, the god of fire and lightning, standing beside Santa Barbara. Alegua is paired with St. Anthony, and Ogun with St. George and St. James. Now, if that surprises you, it's probably because you're used to the presentation of voodoo as a form of Satan worship, and that's not by accident. In fact, it's a carefully curated image designed to frighten white audiences. Books and movies from the late 1800s through the late 1900s linked voodoo with seances, rituals labeled as occult, and the bringing back of dead individuals. This is why you perhaps thought of zombies when I first asked you to think about voodoo. One of the earliest offenders was White Zombie, released in 1932, showing voodoo as a form of mind control.
Zombie! Allez vite! Allez!
This was followed by I Walked with a Zombie in 1943 that used Gothic suspense to tell a story of Caribbean mysticism. Even Black author and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston fell victim to this practice of repackaging African traditions as dangerous in 1938 when her book, Tell My Horse, about her personal experiences in Jamaica and Haiti, was edited for white audiences to include words like horror and terror in sections discussing voodoo. There was also a fascination by mainstream audiences with the idea that Africa was a mysterious and exotic place that was nothing like anything they'd ever known. This mix of fear and curiosity created a vacuum that media was more than happy to fill, even if what they wrote and filmed was almost entirely fiction. In reality, voodoo is a spiritual practice that includes healing, grounding, protection, and connection with the ancestors. It can include charms, talismans, and even drumming and dancing. Inside the Voodoo Museum, you're going to find a much different story than the one Hollywood tells. This collection began in 1972 when Voodoo Charlie, a local man, wanted to preserve the authentic history of this religion and combat misinformation. When Spain took over governing New Orleans, a new law went into effect that gave slaves the ability to purchase their own freedom. They were allowed to earn wages from side jobs like making art or offering medical care. And most importantly, they were legally entitled to keep the wages that they earned. There was already a large population of free people of color in New Orleans, and the new law swelled those numbers to record-breaking size. New Orleans became the largest population of free people of color in all of the United States, increasing the commonality of the practice of voodoo. As voodoo grew in popularity, priests and, more importantly, priestesses rose to prominence in the community. Imagine walking the streets of New Orleans 200 years ago with a serious question on your mind. Or maybe you're a young couple struggling to conceive, or even a politician desperate to secure your next election. If so, then there's only one place you'd go. You need to visit the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. I want you to think about the society in which you live now. Identify how, today, we keep things in separate worlds. If we're sick, we see a doctor, and most likely a specialist dedicated to only one discipline. If we need money, we might visit a bank. And if we need guidance, we might visit a therapist or a church. But that wasn't the case in 1800s New Orleans. Things weren't that cut and dried, not for white or black people, free or enslaved. Think of voodoo as an intersection for all of these things, a solution for a variety of problems. And the priests and priestesses who facilitated the practice of voodoo became very important in colonial society. Marie Laveau is arguably New Orleans' most famous practitioner. She lived in the city as a free woman of color from 1801 to 1881 and was known worldwide as the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. In fact, she only lived a few city blocks from where the first city cemetery, St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, stands today. Which brings us to our next stop on the Voodoo Trail. This was once the site of the home of Marie Laveau. The inn on St. Anne now sits on her old home site and includes the Marie Laveau Annex. She used her home as the focal point for both her spiritual practice and community work, and this building is now part of the National Register of Historic Places. Marie Laveau learned holistic healing practices from her mother, as well as the making of talismans and charms. Her mother was known in their neighborhood as a healer and practitioner, and her daughter joined her in their practice as she aged. And she didn't just practice voodoo, she nurtured the community around her. Many enslaved people were actively purchasing their freedom under these new laws enacted by Spain, and entering a world where they had no place to live, no employed work history, no family to help them. Marie Laveau helped people establish themselves in society and set them up for success and long-term survival, often using the money she charged her wealthier patrons for her services. She's even believed to have helped finance the St. Mary's Academy for Young Ladies of Color, a school educating girls during the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, based on papers found in her attic after her death. Check out the field notes section of our website for a deep dive into all of Marie Laveau's extensive community work. Her spiritual work was so powerful that her reputation spread by word of mouth across the colony. And in time, clients were coming from all over the city, white as well as black, to procure her services. Laveau also worked as a hairdresser to wealthy white women and used her connections inside those homes to keep close tabs on her patrons. Think of it as lending the ancestors an extra hand. This information gave her an extra edge in both her predictions and her guidance. Not only was she experienced in voodoo, but she was also a devout Catholic and attended Mass regularly at St. Louis Cathedral. It might surprise you that this church is the next stop on our voodoo trail. But the reality is that the church played an integral role in the New Orleans-style voodoo practiced in the colony. This is where their spiritual education began, where they learned about the saints to whom they would pray. It may further surprise you that voodoo practitioners often classify themselves as Christians. They don't see themselves as working against the church, but instead as using the natural world that God made as a tool to serve and care for His people. And St. Louis Cathedral, originally built in 1727, was where the elite and wealthy of New Orleans society came to worship, black and white alike. In fact, many wealthy Creole families and free people of color had paid, reserved pews here at the cathedral, in part as a symbol of their status, including the Voodoo Queen herself. But where the Catholic Church is a patriarchy, voodoo is a matriarchy. From St. Louis Cathedral, we're going to travel a few blocks north and west to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 to visit Marie Laveau's final resting place. So I'm here next to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 on what is technically the outside of the original city. This was built in 1789 after a yellow fever epidemic decimated roughly 25% of the city's population, and they needed somewhere better to put all of those bodies. And Marie Laveau, when she passed on, was buried here. I've got some photos of her tomb. The Archdiocese of New Orleans does protect these old Catholic cemeteries, so you can only come inside with a tour. You'll see that people continue to leave trinkets to her, as well as to mark the outside of her tomb with X's. This is an old superstition that you can come and ask her, even beyond the grave, for her protection, her guidance, and to fulfill wishes. And leaving an X on the tomb is part of it. I don't recommend it. They don't like it. You are desecrating the cemetery if you do it now, and you would have to hop the wall at night. So I don't recommend that now. Many voodoo practitioners today do still believe that Marie Laveau is on the other side, making intercession for those who follow her practices. And I will show you coming up next the best place to still bring your offerings to the voodoo priestess of New Orleans. Before we leave the cemetery, I want to share with you a quick controversy surrounding Marie Laveau's grave, or maybe two. The first is that many voodoo practitioners actually resent what the Archdiocese of New Orleans has done by preventing people from honoring her tomb. Leaving objects and money for a spirit intercessor is a very common practice in voodoo and well established. I mean, we're talking hundreds of years of tradition here. And they argue that by preventing people from doing this, the Archdiocese is actually infringing on their religious practice. Because voodoo is, in essence, a living and breathing thing. The rituals involved are unique to the practitioner. And putting rules, and in this case, a literal fence with guards around it, is in opposition to the heart of voodoo. The other little piece of debate that takes place here is whether Marie Laveau's bones are here at all. Now, I was shocked when I heard this, and it was from my Uber driver who picked us up from the airport. And you better believe I had quite the discussion with a few of the tour guides here at the cemetery about it, who confirmed that yes, this is something they get asked about all the time. The claim is that she was never buried here to begin with, and that her remains are kept privately by her family. Honestly, there's a lot of theories out there, but I believe, as do the guides I spoke with, she is here. Her home is close, she was a prominent member of the church and a devout Catholic, and this was the major city cemetery at the time. So with that said, let's move on to where you can safely and respectfully leave your offerings and requests to Marie Laveau, and that is Marie Laveau's House of Voodoo. This is different from the museum we visited earlier, and technically Marie Laveau's in name only. She did not operate any storefronts during her lifetime, even though she did make her services readily available to the community. To modern-day practitioners, she stands as a Loa, a type of Haitian voodoo saint who stands on the spirit realm side, intercessing on behalf of her followers. Her altar sits inside her store on Bourbon Street, and you can bring any item, artifact, or even money if you like, and offer your petition to the priestess. Think of this place as a cross between a gift shop and a memorial. Marie Laveau's notoriety vaulted onto the national stage after her death. Stories surrounding the exotic practices of African people in America in print media grew in popularity, and New Orleans voodoo seemed both foreign and exciting. Her practice continued when her daughter, also named Marie Laveau, took up the community work of her mother, just as Marie took it over from hers. Her daughter was also similarly known as the Voodoo Queen, which caused some confusion for white newspaper reporters who would confuse her with her mother. And those same reporters would then report that Marie Laveau never aged and never died, which of course threw fuel on the fire of the idea that she was never buried in her family's tomb. Now, while it's disrespectful to film Marie Laveau's altar, I can tell you what you're going to find there, or on any voodoo altar. First will be the totem representing the Loa to whom you're making your request. Here, it's Papa Legba, and here, it's Marie Laveau. Second is the Catholic saint with whom they are associated. Again, here, it's St. Peter. Next, you'll often find a veve. This is a symbol drawn in ash, brick dust, or a number of other symbolic powders. Each one is unique to both the one drawing it and the spirit being summoned. It invites that spirit into the space respectfully and requests their blessings. You'll also see charms and talismans. These can be jewelry or symbolic items meant to represent whatever is being drawn in or cast aside. They can also include gree-gree and mojo bags, as well as voodoo dolls. Now, let's take a look inside a protective gree-gree bag together. We'll find some herbs, like basil for protection, and also personal items, such as hair or nail clippings from the person or people who are being protected. This can be followed by minerals like salt and powders like brick dust to invoke grounding energies and protective boundaries. Every gree-gree bag is unique, based on the one making it and the one who commissioned it, and they are uniquely tailored to each individual's purpose. Marie Laveau's gree-gree bags were known to be potent and were carried or worn by several influential members of New Orleans society, including local politicians. Now let's take a look at what goes into a voodoo doll. We'll have to start by throwing away the traditional concept of a voodoo doll as something sinister, used to cause harm to other people. As I've said before, this is another example of Western media and propaganda designed to provoke fear and misrepresent African traditions to white audiences. Their real purpose is much more positive. Think of them as channels for manifestation and positive energy. After purchasing a doll, the user can add an item of personal significance that ties the doll to them, like hair or a paper with their name on it. They then add items that represent, symbolically, the things they are calling to themselves. A coin for money, a heart pendant for love, a baby rattle for fertility and conception. The doll is placed in an area where the user is likely to see it every day and reinforce their intention on their personal goals. This kind of voodoo doesn't follow rules. Every priest or priestess has their own ceremonies and customs, and its practitioners continue to offer readings, custom blend gree-gree bags, or even make voodoo dolls for their followers to this day. And you can find these professionals all over the city, not just in the shops or museums.
So, voodoo isn't something that needs to be feared. It's mysterious, the way all religions have a quality of mystery to them. It encourages community and responsibility, and it emphasizes protection and good fortune. That's how Marie Laveau's family used it. They used it to nurture their community. They looked after one another. But make no mistake, voodoo should also be respected. For as many ways as there are to bless someone, there are also ways to curse someone. Laveau was well known to have powers beyond her massive social network. She communicated with unseen forces, and this was a fact repeated by people of power in New Orleans who sought her counsel. There's a reason she was allowed to continue doing whatever she wanted in the French Quarter. So if you are not a regular practitioner, I recommend you enjoy this religion from a respectful distance. And I encourage you not to stir up anything that might follow you home. See you in the next one.
Stay away from that old viper man. Don't you take that fruit